Welcome to a documentary experience defined by absolute transparency. We guarantee that the upcoming scenes are entirely unfiltered and unedited. This is raw, immersive footage from the front lines of justice, providing an unpolished look at those who uphold the law.
Ma'am, stop right there.
Is there a problem, officer?
Where are you flying today?
Atlanta, to see my mother.
What do you do for work?
I work in the federal court system.
Step aside. I'm searching your bags.
I do not consent to a search of my briefcase.
You're being uncooperative.
The security camera footage from Terminal C would later become the most damning piece of evidence in what many legal experts called the most shocking case of racial profiling ever caught on tape. It was Christmas Eve morning, 6:23 a.m., and the airport was unusually quiet. Most travelers were already home with their families or settling into their holiday destinations. The few passengers moving through the terminal were mostly airline crews heading to work or business travelers catching the last flights before the holiday shutdown. What happened in those early morning hours would spark a federal investigation, destroy multiple careers, and prove that racism doesn't take holidays. The woman walking calmly through that terminal had no idea she was about to become the center of a story that would change airport security protocols nationwide and cost the city millions of dollars in settlements. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Trust me, the ending will leave you speechless. Judge Victoria Harper was exactly where she was supposed to be that Christmas Eve morning. She had just finished a grueling 3-week trial that had kept her in court until nearly midnight on December 23rd. The case involved a complex fraud scheme that had taken months to unravel, and she had finally delivered her verdict late the night before. Now she was catching the first flight out to spend Christmas with her elderly mother in Atlanta. Victoria was 52 years old, a respected federal judge who had served on the bench for over a decade. She had worked her way up from a public defender to a prosecutor, then to private practice, before being nominated to the federal bench by the president himself. She was known for her fairness, her thorough legal reasoning, and her ability to cut through complex legal arguments to find the truth. That morning, she wore a simple black wool coat over a burgundy sweater and dark slacks. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she carried a small leather briefcase along with her rolling suitcase. Everything about her appearance suggested exactly what she was, a professional woman traveling for personal reasons during the holidays. She had arrived at the airport 2 hours early, as she always did. Victoria believed in being prepared and punctual. She had checked her bag, gone through the standard security screening without incident, and was now walking toward her gate. Her flight didn't board for another hour, but she preferred to get settled early rather than rush. Officer Derek Sullivan had been working airport security for 6 years. He was 34 years old, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, and had the kind of presence that made people notice when he entered a room. He had joined the airport police force after a brief stint with the city police department that had ended under circumstances he preferred not to discuss with his current colleagues. Sullivan had a reputation among his fellow officers. Some called him thorough, others used different words when they thought he couldn't hear them. What everyone agreed on was that Sullivan seemed to have a particular interest in certain types of travelers. Black professionals, especially those who dressed well or carried expensive luggage, seemed to catch his attention more often than statistical probability would suggest. His supervisors had received complaints before, 3 in the past 2 years, to be specific. Each complaint had been investigated and deemed unfounded. Each complainant had been told that Officer Sullivan was simply doing his job and that random security checks were a necessary part of keeping the airport safe. The complaints had been filed away and forgotten. But this Christmas Eve morning, Officer Sullivan was about to make a mistake that would cost him everything he thought he had built. He spotted Judge Victoria Harper from across the terminal, and something in his expression shifted. He began walking in her direction with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he had already made up his mind about something. Victoria noticed him approaching but thought nothing of it. Airport security officers moved around the terminals constantly. It was their job to be visible and alert. She continued walking toward her gate, checking her phone to see if there were any updates about her flight. The weather forecast had mentioned possible snow. and she wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any delays. Officer Sullivan intercepted her near gate C14. Without any preliminary greeting or explanation, he told her to stop. Victoria looked up from her phone, confused but compliant. She asked if there was a problem. Sullivan didn't really answer her question. Instead, he asked her where she was traveling to. She told him Atlanta. He asked why she was going to Atlanta. She said she was visiting family for Christmas. These questions had no legitimate security purpose, and Victoria began to understand what was happening. She had heard about situations like this from friends and colleagues. She had read the studies about racial profiling in airports. She had even ruled on cases involving discrimination by law enforcement officers, but experiencing it firsthand was different from reading about it in legal briefs. Sullivan asked to see her identification and boarding pass. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. She handed him her driver's license and showed him her boarding pass on her phone. He studied the ID for much longer than necessary, holding it up to the light and examining it from different angles as if he suspected it might be fake. Around them, other passengers continued moving through the terminal freely. An elderly white man with a large duffel bag passed by without drawing Sullivan's attention. A young white woman talking loudly on her phone walked past, carrying multiple shopping bags and didn't even get a second glance. Victoria noticed this pattern immediately. Sullivan asked her what she did for work. This question crossed a line, and Victoria knew it. Random security screenings were supposed to focus on potential threats to aviation security, not personal employment information. But she answered anyway, saying simply that she worked in law. Sullivan made a face that suggested skepticism. He asked what kind of law. She said she worked in the federal court system. This answer seemed to annoy him rather than reassure him. He asked her to step aside because he wanted to search her belongings. Victoria knew she had rights in this situation. She knew the law better than almost anyone in that terminal. But she also knew that asserting those rights too aggressively could escalate the situation in unpredictable ways. She stepped aside with Officer Sullivan, hoping to resolve whatever this was quickly and quietly. She had nothing to hide. Her luggage contained exactly what anyone would expect from a professional woman taking a short holiday trip: clothes, toiletries, a book, some work documents she planned to review on the plane, and a small wrapped gift for her mother. Sullivan opened her rolling suitcase right there in the middle of the terminal. He began removing her belongings piece by piece, laying them out on a nearby bench where anyone walking by could see everything. Her blouses, her undergarments, her pajamas, her shoes. Each item was examined and set aside with what felt like unnecessary deliberation. Other passengers began to notice what was happening. Some stared openly. Others looked away quickly, embarrassed to witness what was clearly becoming a humiliating spectacle. A few pulled out their phones and began recording, though they tried to be discreet about it. Victoria stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, maintaining her composure despite the anger building inside her. She had spent decades in courtrooms dealing with difficult situations and hostile attorneys. She knew how to keep her emotions in check, even when she was being treated unfairly. But this was testing her limits. Sullivan went through her toiletry bag next, opening bottles of shampoo and lotion, squeezing her toothpaste tube, examining her makeup as if he expected to find contraband hidden in her foundation. He was being thorough in a way that felt personal and vindictive rather than professional. Then he told her he needed to search her briefcase. This was where Victoria drew a line. Her briefcase contained sensitive legal documents, some of which were covered by attorney-client privilege and judicial confidentiality. She politely but firmly told Officer Sullivan that the briefcase contained privileged legal materials and that he would need a warrant or probable cause to search it. Sullivan's reaction to this assertion of her rights would become a key piece of evidence in the federal lawsuit that followed. Instead of backing down or calling a supervisor to clarify the legal boundaries of his authority, he became more aggressive. He told Victoria that she was being uncooperative and that uncooperative passengers could be detained for additional screening. Victoria pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction. The moment that phone came up, Officer Sullivan's entire demeanor changed. He told her to put the phone away immediately. She calmly explained that she had the right to record a public official performing their duties in a public space. This was basic constitutional law, and she knew it better than most. But Officer Sullivan either didn't know the law or didn't care. He stepped closer to Victoria, invading her personal space in a way that felt threatening. He repeated his demand that she stop recording. When she continued to hold the phone up, he called for backup. 2 additional officers responded to Sullivan's call. Officer Rebecca Martinez arrived first, followed by Officer James Fletcher. Both officers assessed the scene. A well-dressed black woman standing calmly beside a bench, covered with her personal belongings, holding up a phone to record, while Officer Sullivan stood uncomfortably close to her, looking agitated. Martinez asked Sullivan what was happening. He explained that he was conducting a routine security screening, but that the passenger was being uncooperative and refusing to comply with lawful orders. Martinez looked at the belongings spread across the bench, looked at Victoria standing quietly with her phone, and seemed to sense that something about Sullivan's story didn't add up. Officer Fletcher asked Victoria for her side of the story. She explained calmly and clearly that she had complied with every reasonable request, had allowed her luggage to be searched, but had declined to allow the search of privileged legal documents in her briefcase. She said she was recording the interaction because she believed she was being racially profiled. The word profiling seemed to make all 3 officers uncomfortable. Martinez suggested they call a supervisor to clarify the situation, but Sullivan objected. He said he was handling the situation and didn't need supervisory intervention. Fletcher looked uncertain, caught between backing up a fellow officer and recognizing that the situation was becoming problematic. That's when Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She identified herself not just as a lawyer, but as a federal judge. She showed them her judicial identification and explained that she was trying to catch a flight to spend Christmas with her family. She asked if there was any legitimate security reason for the extensive search of her belongings and the continued detention. The 3 officers exchanged glances. They all understood immediately that this situation had just become much more complicated than a routine security screening. Officer Sullivan, however, seemed unable or unwilling to back down from the path he had chosen. He had chosen. Instead of de-escalating, Sullivan doubled down on his authority. He told Victoria that being a judge didn't give her special privileges when it came to airport security. He said she still needed to comply with all screening procedures, including allowing him to search her briefcase. His voice was getting louder, attracting even more attention from passing travelers. Officer Martinez tried to intervene diplomatically. She suggested they move the entire situation to a private screening area where they could sort everything out away from the growing crowd of onlookers. But Sullivan refused, saying there was nothing to sort out and that Victoria simply needed to cooperate fully or face detention. Victoria remained remarkably calm throughout this exchange. Years of dealing with hostile attorneys and difficult defendants in her courtroom had taught her the value of keeping her composure under pressure. She continued recording and clearly stated for the camera that she was a federal judge being detained without probable cause by airport security. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger. Several passengers had pulled out their own phones and were recording the scene from different angles. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped and asked if everything was okay. A young mother with 2 small children paused to watch, her face showing obvious concern for what she was witnessing. Sullivan seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond his control, but instead of backing down, he made the worst decision of his career. He told Victoria that she was under arrest for interfering with airport security operations. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt. Victoria clearly stated that she did not consent to being arrested and asked what specific crime she was being charged with. Sullivan couldn't give a coherent answer. He mumbled something about obstruction and failure to comply with lawful orders, but when pressed for details about which laws she had allegedly broken, he became increasingly agitated. Officer Fletcher finally stepped forward and suggested they call their supervisor before making any arrests. He had been watching the interaction unfold and could see that Sullivan was making serious procedural errors, but Sullivan was too committed to his course of action to listen to reason. The handcuffs clicked around Victoria's wrists at exactly 6:47 a.m., according to the security camera timestamp. The sound seemed to echo through the terminal, causing a ripple of shocked reactions from the growing crowd of witnesses. Several people audibly gasped. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Victoria stood there in handcuffs, maintaining her dignity despite the humiliating circumstances. She looked directly into her phone camera, which was still recording, and clearly stated her name, her position as a federal judge, the time, and the fact that she was being arrested without probable cause. A teenage girl in the crowd started crying. She told her mother that this was wrong, that the police shouldn't be treating the lady this way. An elderly man approached Officer Martinez and demanded to know why they were arresting someone who hadn't done anything wrong. Martinez looked uncomfortable but didn't have answers. Sullivan seemed energized by having finally taken decisive action. He told the crowd to disperse and mind their own business. When people didn't immediately move away, he raised his voice and threatened to arrest anyone who interfered with police operations. This only made more people pull out their phones to record. Officer Fletcher radioed for a police van to transport Victoria to the station. His voice was tense, and he kept looking around at all the witnesses and cameras. He seemed to understand that this incident was going to have consequences far beyond a simple arrest report. Victoria asked to speak to her attorney. This is a basic right that should have been granted immediately, but Sullivan told her she could make her phone call after she was processed at the station. This was another violation of proper procedure, and the crowd of witnesses was hearing every word. A pilot walking through the terminal in his uniform stopped when he saw what was happening. He approached Officer Martinez and identified himself as a commercial airline captain. He said he had witnessed the entire interaction and wanted to go on record that the woman had been cooperative throughout. Martinez took his contact information, though she looked like she wished she were anywhere else. The police van arrived, and Sullivan prepared to escort Victoria out of the terminal. As they walked through the concourse, more people stopped to stare. Some recognized her as a judge, having seen her photo in newspaper articles about high-profile cases she had handled. Word began spreading through the terminal that the woman in handcuffs was actually a federal judge. Victoria's flight to Atlanta was boarding when they reached the terminal exit. She could hear the gate agent announcing the final boarding call for her flight. She thought about her mother, who would be waiting at the Atlanta airport in a few hours, wondering why her daughter hadn't arrived for Christmas. She thought about the gift in her luggage that she had carefully wrapped for her mother. She thought about how this humiliating experience would overshadow what should have been a peaceful holiday reunion. The van ride to the police station took 20 minutes through light Christmas Eve traffic. Sullivan sat in the front passenger seat while Victoria sat in the back, behind a wire mesh partition. He kept looking back at her in the rearview mirror, as if expecting her to say something, but Victoria remained silent. She was already thinking like a lawyer, mentally documenting every detail of what had happened for the complaints and lawsuits that would inevitably follow. At the police station, Victoria was processed like any other arrestee. Her fingerprints were taken, her photo was captured, and her personal belongings were inventoried and stored. The desk sergeant who handled her processing seemed surprised when he read her occupation on the booking paperwork. He looked at her twice, clearly recognizing that something unusual was happening. Sullivan filled out an incident report that would later be torn apart by federal investigators. In his written account, he claimed that Victoria had been acting suspiciously, had refused to comply with security screening procedures, and had become belligerent when questioned about her travel plans. Every single one of these claims was contradicted by the video evidence that dozens of witnesses had captured. Victoria was placed in a holding cell at 8:15 a.m. The cell was cold, cramped, and smelled of disinfectant and despair. She sat on the metal bench and tried to process what had just happened to her. In her decades of legal experience, she had seen injustice take many forms, but experiencing it personally was profoundly different from reading about it in case files. Word of her arrest began spreading beyond the airport. Someone had posted one of the witness videos on social media, and it was being shared rapidly across platforms. The caption read, "Federal judge arrested for flying while black on Christmas Eve." Within hours, the video had thousands of views and hundreds of outraged comments. Victoria's law clerk received a call from a reporter asking for comment about the arrest. The clerk immediately contacted Victoria's attorney, who rushed to the police station to secure her release. Local news stations started covering the story, with breaking news alerts interrupting regular Christmas Eve programming. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the incident was causing operational disruptions. Passengers were sharing videos and discussing what they had witnessed. Some were calling their own attorneys or contacting civil rights organizations. The airport's public relations department was scrambling to respond to media inquiries about racial profiling policies. Officer Sullivan completed his paperwork and went home for Christmas Eve, apparently believing he had simply done his job. He had no idea that his actions had been recorded from multiple angles by numerous witnesses. He didn't know that within hours, legal experts would be analyzing his behavior on national television. He couldn't have imagined that his name would soon be known across the country as a symbol of institutional racism. The police station's phone began ringing constantly as news of the arrest spread. Civil rights leaders were demanding answers. Legal organizations were offering to represent Victoria pro bono. Politicians were calling for investigations. What had started as one officer's decision to target a black woman at an airport was rapidly escalating into a national scandal that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Victoria's attorney, David Richardson, arrived at the police station at 10:30 a.m. Richardson was a seasoned civil rights lawyer who had spent 20 years fighting discrimination cases across the federal court system. He had represented everyone from wrongfully terminated employees to victims of police brutality. But when he walked into that holding area and saw a federal judge sitting in a jail cell on Christmas Eve, even he was stunned. Richardson immediately demanded Victoria's release and threatened to file emergency motions in federal court if she wasn't freed within the hour. The desk sergeant, who was beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation his department had created, started making phone calls up the chain of command. Victoria was released on her own recognizance at 11:45 a.m., nearly 5 hours after her initial detention. As she walked out of the police station, she was greeted by a small crowd of reporters who had gathered after word of her arrest spread through social media. Camera flashes went off as she emerged, and microphones were thrust toward her face. She made a brief statement, speaking with the measured tone she used in her courtroom. She said she would be pursuing all available legal remedies to ensure that what happened to her never happened to anyone else. She thanked the witnesses who had recorded the incident and stayed to provide statements. And she expressed hope that this Christmas Eve would mark a turning point in how law enforcement treats people of color. By noon, Victoria's arrest was the lead story on every major news network. Legal analysts were calling it one of the most clear-cut cases of racial profiling ever captured on video. The footage showed an experienced federal judge being humiliated and arrested for no apparent reason other than the color of her skin. The airport's executive director held an emergency meeting with his senior staff. They reviewed the security camera footage from every angle and interviewed the officers involved. What they saw was devastating. There was no justification for Sullivan's actions, no legitimate security concern that had prompted the extensive search and eventual arrest. Officer Sullivan's personnel file was pulled for review. Investigators discovered not only the 3 previous complaints about racial profiling, but also several concerning incidents that had never been formally reported. A pattern emerged of an officer who seemed to have a particular interest in harassing successful black travelers. The airport police chief, Robert Hayes, found himself in an impossible position. He had defended Sullivan after previous complaints, dismissing them as misunderstandings or the complaints of disgruntled passengers. Now he had to explain to federal investigators why an officer with a documented history of questionable behavior had been allowed to continue working without additional training or supervision. Victoria spent Christmas Eve in her hotel room instead of with her mother in Atlanta. Her flight had long since departed, and all subsequent flights were fully booked due to the holiday rush. She sat on the hotel bed, still wearing the same clothes she had put on that morning when she thought she was going to have a peaceful Christmas reunion. Her phone rang constantly, reporters wanting interviews, colleagues offering support, civil rights organizations wanting to discuss legal strategy. Victoria's mother called from Atlanta, having seen the news coverage. Through tears, she told her daughter how proud she was of her dignity and strength in the face of such treatment. Social media exploded with outrage over the incident. The hashtag Justice for Judge Harper began trending nationally. People shared their own stories of racial profiling at airports and other public spaces. The video of Victoria's arrest was viewed millions of times, sparking conversations about systemic racism that reached every corner of the country. Officer Sullivan returned to work the day after Christmas, apparently unaware of the firestorm his actions had created. He was immediately called into a meeting with his supervisors and informed that he was being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. When he asked what investigation, they showed him the news coverage. Sullivan's face went pale as he watched himself on national television, handcuffing a federal judge for no apparent reason. He tried to explain that he had been following standard security procedures, but his supervisors had already reviewed the footage. There was nothing standard about what he had done. The FBI opened a federal civil rights investigation within 48 hours of the incident. Agents interviewed every witness who had been present at the airport that morning. They collected all available video footage from security cameras and cell phones. They subpoenaed Sullivan's personnel records and began examining his pattern of behavior over the past several years. Victoria filed a federal lawsuit 3 days after her arrest. The complaint, drafted by Richardson and his team, alleged violations of her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure, her 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law, and her First Amendment rights to free speech and recording public officials. The lawsuit didn't just target Officer Sullivan, it named the airport authority, the police department, and supervisory personnel who had failed to address Sullivan's previous pattern of discriminatory behavior. The legal theory was that these institutions had created a culture that enabled and encouraged racial profiling. Quick question for you watching. Have you or someone you know ever experienced treatment like this? Type your thoughts in the comments below. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed shocking details about the airport police department's culture. Internal emails showed supervisors making jokes about passengers who filed discrimination complaints. Training records revealed that officers received minimal instruction on constitutional rights and proper screening procedures. Officer Fletcher, who had been present during Victoria's arrest, agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. He provided a detailed account of Sullivan's behavior that day, confirming that there had been no legitimate security justification for the extensive search or subsequent arrest. Fletcher admitted he had been too intimidated by Sullivan's aggressive personality to intervene more forcefully. Officer Martinez also came forward with information about Sullivan's history. She revealed that several officers had complained privately about his targeting of minority passengers, but that these concerns had never been formally documented because officers feared retaliation from supervisors who protected Sullivan. The airport authority's insurance company began preparing for a massive settlement payout. Legal experts were predicting that Victoria's case could result in one of the largest discrimination settlements in airport security history. The combination of clear video evidence, a sympathetic plaintiff, and obvious institutional failures created a perfect storm for the defendants. Sullivan hired a private attorney using funds from his police union's legal defense fund. His lawyer tried to argue that Sullivan had been following his training and acting within the scope of his authority. But this defense fell apart when investigators revealed that Sullivan's actions that morning violated multiple department policies and federal regulations. The case attracted attention from civil rights organizations across the country. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed an amicus brief supporting Victoria's lawsuit. The American Civil Liberties Union launched a broader investigation into racial profiling at airports nationwide, using Victoria's case as a catalyst for examining systemic problems. Victoria received hundreds of letters of support from fellow judges, attorneys, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by her story. Many shared their own experiences with discrimination and praised her courage in fighting back against injustice. Several law schools invited her to speak about her experience and its implications for civil rights law. The airport implemented emergency policy changes in response to the incident. Officers were required to document the specific reason for any passenger screening that went beyond standard procedures. Supervisors had to approve any searches of personal belongings that lasted more than 10 minutes. Body cameras became mandatory for all security interactions. These changes came too late to help Victoria, but they represented a recognition that fundamental reforms were needed. The airport authority hired a civil rights consultant to review all policies and procedures related to passenger screening and officer conduct. Sullivan's union initially defended his actions, releasing a statement that officers had to make split-second decisions in challenging circumstances. But as more details emerged about his pattern of behavior, even his union representatives began distancing themselves from his case. The federal investigation expanded beyond Victoria's individual case to examine systemic issues within the airport police department. Investigators found evidence of discriminatory practices that affected not just passengers, but also minority employees within the department itself. Several officers came forward to report that they had witnessed or been aware of discriminatory behavior, but had been discouraged from reporting it through official channels. A culture of silence and retaliation had allowed problems to fester for years without proper oversight. The case sparked congressional hearings on racial profiling and transportation security. Victoria was invited to testify before a House subcommittee about her experience and recommendations for preventing similar incidents. Her testimony was calm, detailed, and devastating in its documentation of institutional failures. Airport authorities across the country began reviewing their own policies and training programs in light of Victoria's case. No one wanted to become the next subject of a viral video showing clear discrimination against passengers. The financial costs of the incident continued mounting for the defendants. Legal fees, settlement negotiations, policy changes, and reputational damage created expenses that reached well into the millions of dollars. What had started as one officer's decision to harass a passenger was becoming a costly lesson in the price of institutional racism. Victoria's case became a teaching tool in law schools and police academies. The clear video evidence and straightforward facts made it an ideal example of how not to conduct security screenings and how discrimination lawsuits develop from seemingly routine interactions. The psychological impact on Victoria was something she dealt with privately. Despite her composed public demeanor, the experience of being handcuffed and jailed for no reason had affected her deeply. She sought counseling to process the trauma while continuing to pursue justice through the legal system. Officer Sullivan's life unraveled as the investigation progressed. Facing federal charges, civil lawsuits, and the loss of his career, he struggled to understand how his actions that Christmas Eve morning had led to such devastating consequences. His inability to recognize the wrongness of his behavior became a central issue in psychological evaluations. The psychological evaluations ordered by the court revealed disturbing insights into Sullivan's mindset. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist with decades of experience evaluating law enforcement officers, conducted extensive interviews with Sullivan over several weeks. Her findings painted a picture of someone who genuinely believed his actions were justified, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Sullivan repeatedly told Dr. Mitchell that he had been doing his job properly and that Victoria had been acting suspiciously. When shown the video footage of the incident, he claimed the cameras didn't capture everything and that his instincts as a seasoned officer had detected threats that weren't visible to others. This level of self-deception troubled even experienced evaluators. The psychological assessment became a key piece of evidence in the federal case. Dr. Mitchell's report concluded that Sullivan displayed classic signs of racial bias that had become so deeply ingrained he could no longer recognize it as such. She noted that his inability to acknowledge wrongdoing suggested the discrimination was systematic rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. Victoria's legal team used these findings to strengthen their argument that Sullivan's behavior represented a pattern of institutional racism rather than an isolated incident. The psychological evaluation showed that years of unchecked bias had created a mindset where targeting minority passengers seemed not just acceptable but necessary for proper security. The airport authorities' internal investigation uncovered additional troubling evidence. Email records showed that Sullivan had sent messages to colleagues containing racial jokes and stereotypes about certain passenger demographics. These communications had been ignored by supervisors who should have recognized them as warning signs of discriminatory attitudes. Training records revealed that Sullivan had consistently scored poorly on cultural sensitivity assessments, but had never been required to undergo additional education or counseling. His supervisors had treated these scores as bureaucratic paperwork rather than indicators of potential problems with his fitness for duty. The financial settlement negotiations began in earnest as the defendants realized their legal position was hopeless. Victoria's attorneys presented evidence that was so overwhelming that even the most aggressive defense lawyers advised their clients to settle rather than face a jury trial that would likely result in even larger damages. The airport authority's insurance carrier conducted its own investigation and reached the same conclusion. They authorized settlement talks immediately, hoping to limit their exposure before the case attracted even more national attention and potential punitive damages from a sympathetic jury. The final settlement, reached 8 months later, totaled $4.7 million, one of the largest discrimination payouts in airport security history. Officer Sullivan was terminated and permanently banned from law enforcement. Chief Hayes resigned in disgrace. The airport implemented sweeping reforms, including mandatory bias training, civilian oversight, and federal monitoring that continues to this day. Victoria used her settlement to establish a foundation supporting victims of racial profiling. She returned to the bench stronger than ever, knowing that her Christmas Eve nightmare had prevented countless others from experiencing the same injustice. Sometimes standing up costs everything, but sometimes, just sometimes, it changes everything. That's the power of refusing to accept what's wrong as normal. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.
Driven by the pursuit of truth, our mission is to demand transparency and hold power to account. We trust in hard evidence because the records do not lie. Thank you for watching and staying informed.